This is an update of a video that I put out last year by the same name. Read a few more books this year. Worst book that I read this year was The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. Heinlein gets on my nerves of all the writers that have been featured on this channel. I think he annoys me the most. There are technical competencies in Moon is a Harsh Mistress that are higher than other books that I ranked higher. Heinlein just gets on my nerves. The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell was almost as irritating to me in its attempts at kind of quippy, smarmy humor. I don't think that that stuff ages that well, and I didn't think that the novel was interesting enough to support its kind of rambling, meandering plot or the humor. Three Body Problem, I've talked unto death on this channel if you want my full thoughts. There's a longer review up. I thought it is, think it is, very overrated and not especially of great literary value, I don't think. River of Gods by Ian MacDonald had a good first half. It's cyberpunk that gets bogged down, again, in its own plot, and is overly sexual in a way that majorly distracts from what you're trying to read. Night Flyers by George R.R. Martin is a novella that is quite literally completely forgettable. I think I remember one or two details about it tops, and for that reason I'm out. The Goat Without Horns by Thomas Burnett Swan, speaking of horny books, is a very barely competently written, although occasionally beautiful and narratively reckless book by a forgotten fantasy author who himself is interesting. Not the best read, but kind of zany. Can You Feel Anything When I Do This is a collection of short stories by Robert Sheckley that has a great cover, great title. Again, I think that humor just doesn't age that well. And I'm also a tough sell when it comes to comedy, generally. So it was competent, but forgettable, and I thought not as clever as it wanted to be. What Strange Stars and Skies, a short story compilation from Avram Davidson, a person who is supposed to be experimental and strange, but I found rather prosaic. Again, kind of forgettable, kind of mediocre. Titan's Daughter by James Blish was a fix-up, I believe, of two short stories about giants on a college campus. It kind of reads like the X-Men if it was bogged down in a lot of hard science exposition and not a whole lot happened. It was okay. 17 Times Infinity is a short story anthology edited by Groff Conklin that I thought was very mixed. It does include The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster, which I think is probably the best novella I've ever read in science fiction. If you're into dystopian lit, check that one out. The rest of it is kind of skippable, or a lot of it is. The Gray Prince by Jack Vance, read it recently, and I think it might be the most right-wing book I've ever read, or novel that I've ever read. I think it unseats Past Master by Lafferty. It's very competent because it's Jack Vance, but I think makes a political point that is idiotic and regressive to the point of being fascistic, and for that reason I'm out. On the Beach by Neville Shute, I've found okay. It's a really celebrated classic. It's about the end of the world, post-nuclear or mid-nuclear apocalypse story about people trying to cope with the impending death of themselves and everybody that they know. Interesting premise, poignant premise. I thought the execution was a little bit dull. Dune Messiah did not live up to Dune. I thought that it felt like it was rushed. I felt like it was pieced together from a little bit too much disparate material, and I thought that the character work was not nearly as interesting as in the first Dune. Universe 5 by Terry Carr is a short story anthology that has some really interesting, innovative stuff in it. There's a story from Le Guin in there about Schrodinger's cat that's pretty memorable. There's a George Alec Effinger story in there that's very good. And there's an Edgar Pangborn story that's absolutely gorgeous. Some good stuff in there. It is, like most anthologies, kind of a mixed bag. I, Robot by Isaac Asimov is a fix-up of short stories. They're all thought experiments about artificial intelligence, or robot intelligence, I guess. Some interesting stuff. There's some cool world building, or universe building rather, right at the very end that kind of opens up into a bigger picture. But for the most part, the short stories are rather narrow in their conception and not, again, all that interesting. Mixed bag. The Best of Robert Bloch. He was a horror writer for the most part. It's all pretty pulpy except for one story called The Funnel of God that is amazing, amazing, amazing. I don't know how he pulled that story off because it was like it was written by a different author. Seek that story out and read it. The Deloriad by Missouri Williams is a really bleak post-apocalyptic novel that deals with some extreme subject matter, but was inventive and kind of cool and interesting, if bleak. The writing style is fairly experimental as well. Not bad, but definitely not for everyone. Voyage of the Space Beagle is a classic space opera among classic space operas by A.E. Van Vogt. Big influence on a lot of stuff that followed it, including Star Trek and including Alien. The story called, I think, The Red Menace or something like that, that Alien was based on is a great read. It is slightly dated, and I don't quite go in for this era of space opera. It is better than Galactic Patrol by Doc Smith. City in the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke is a Dying Earth novel that is pretty soft around the edges, just a little bit suburban, but is beautiful and lyrical in parts. Clarke had moments of being very authorial in that way, and there's a lot of them in there. Frankenstein Unbound by Brian Aldiss was a retelling slash rehashing of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. It's a time travel slash alternate dimension story about a politician who finds himself back in time in the events of the original novel. I think that it kind of retreads the same thematic ground as Frankenstein, and it felt just a little bit like fan fiction to me. One on Me by Tim Huntley is a utopian slash dystopian novel that is actually funny, did make me laugh, but kind of steps on a bunch of rake heads, especially in terms of certain subject matter that's in there. I thought that it was a little clumsy, and it's Tim Huntley's only novel, which I guess is too bad because I would have liked to have seen more stuff from him because I think it's way above average for a forgotten, obscure science fiction book. Dream Snake by Vonda McIntyre was an effective science fantasy about a medicine woman that uses snake venom, and it's a neat trick. Trick sounds pejorative. It's a neat thing that she did. It's strictly science fiction, but it reads like fantasy. I know that a lot of people do that, but there's something about it that's kind of neat. I did find it just a little bit boring in spots, though. Capricorn Games is a short story compilation from Robert Silverberg. It's not his best material. There's some stuff in there that I found a little indulgent, broke the fourth wall too much, but there are a couple novellas, including one dystopian one that read like a William Gibson short story that was superb. It's Silverberg. You pretty much can't go wrong with Silverberg. Will-O-the-Wisp is by the same guy that did The Goat Without Horns. I thought that this was a lot prettier. It's about it's like a retelling of fairy stories from, I think, Wales. And also very horny, but I think is a better book. God's Demon is by Wayne Barlow, my favorite genre artist. It's his first work of fiction. I think it is clumsy a little bit in parts, but if you like high fantasy, if you like stuff like Lord of the Rings, having not read a ton of fantasy, this is up there, not with Lord of the Rings, but it's some great, superb horror fantasy world building. Takes place in hell, some great ecology of hell. He writes it like a science fiction book. There's some really good stuff in there. I do recommend it. Rourke by Avram Davidson was the first Davidson that I read. It's about a guy that goes to an alien planet to kind of pack it in after a fizzled career, winds up getting involved in this economic plot with the governing authority on the planet. It's pretty good. There's some cool aliens in it, but it is mixed, it is uneven. It doesn't quite stick in memory as great. Virtual Unrealities is a short story collection from Alfred Bester. It doesn't work quite as well as the longer form fiction that I've read from Bester, but it's Bester, so it's very good. The stories do end up feeling just a little bit samey, but it's a good story. And Bester, of course, we all know is a great writer. There's some amazing stuff in there. The Chrysalids is my least favorite. No, that's not true. Kraken Wakes is my least favorite. Wyndham, This Is Next. A lot of people like this the most. It read a little bit like YA to me. It's a cautionary tale about Orthodox Christianity. My feeling about these stories is kind of, I get it at this point. It's perfectly fine, and Wyndham was an excellent writer. Certainly not bad. It just felt a little bit tread over by me personally. I've read a lot of books like that. The Gods Themselves by Isaac Asimov is really top heavy in a good way. The first two of the three sections of it are great, especially the first one. And then the third one is homage to Moon is a Harsh Mistress that manages to be even more boring than the Heinlein work. Mixed bag. I don't think that it's his best novel, as some people say. I definitely think that that's foundation of the stuff that I've read, or maybe Foundation and Empire, but pretty good. Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur Clarke. It's good. It's Clarke, so the writing is decent. It's very staid, down the middle, and a little dull, a little bit slow. That might be heretical to some people, but I think you have to admit that it's true, but certainly not bad. Star Maker by Stapleton. Very boring philosophical novel with quite literally no plot, but some amazing kaleidoscopic meditations on like speculative alien life. He says, tripping over his own tongue. Star Maker. It is a big grab bag of insane ideas. The source material for a lot of stuff that followed. An amazing book, beautiful in parts, but also very dense, impenetrable, and boring in parts. The Overlords of War is a French hard SF time travel novel that was published in the mid-70s. It does a lot of things right. It does some things not right. It is pretty racist in one part. Overall, if you like that kind of stuff, it is above average. Vor by James Blish feels like it takes place in the same universe as his After Such Knowledge books. It's not as good as them. It is slower, drier, but has a lot to say about Cold War politics generally, and there's a very cool alien in it. I do recommend it. 2001: A Space Odyssey might be my favorite Clarke. I haven't read Childhood's End in forever. I did a little run of reading hard SF classics from the big three. This was my favorite of them. There is a part in it that is about the physics of taking a dump in space that I thought, out of all of it, that was the thing that I remembered the most and the most clearly. Word for World is Forest by Le Guin is very good. It's Le Guin in a different mode, clippier, angrier. I think maybe more accessible to a lot of people because her big long novels tend to be a little baroque and anthropological, which isn't to everybody's tastes. I love them. If you want an entree into Le Guin, maybe start with this one if you like eco stories and stories about colonialism and indigenous rights. Something that Jack Vance hates. The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard. Beautifully written, evocative, important book. I think also about colonialism, about the fall of the British Empire. I think I keep calling books boring. It's not that they're boring. It's like there's this missing X factor of like the book making me compulsively read it, and Ballard has never produced that feeling in me as much as I love and respect his work. Pastel City by M. John Harrison is also way above average in terms of the literary value. Science fantasy that was not as experimental or weird as I had hoped for. It's the first of his Vericonium books. I get the impression that the later ones are weirder. Great battle scenes. Certainly good. I need to read more Harrison, though, to really catch the bug, I think. The Two Towers by a guy named J.R.R. Tolkien. I had a mixed reaction to Fellowship of the Ring. It took me for literally a lifetime to finally finish. I tried to read it like 15, 20 times over the course of my life. Finally nailed it. Two Towers is way better. It's much less dull, and there's like an intelligence and kind of a coy cynicism in it that I think is great. It really stood out to me upon reading it, and it made me, this sounds so arrogant, but it made me look at Tolkien in a little bit of a different light as someone who wasn't just doing world building, someone who really had something to say in his fiction. I have not read Return of the King. I intend to. The Einstein Intersection by Delaney, speaking of experimental fiction, is a rather difficult, rather out there new wave novel about mythology, Greek mythology, and I think about gender as well, I seem to recall. I don't remember all that much detail with this one. I remember a sense of being befuddled and also impressed by Delaney, which I think is a feeling that should be familiar to anybody who's read anything by Delaney. It's not my favorite Delaney. I think that would have to be Nova, but it is good. House on the Borderlands by William Hope Hodgson is a fix-up novel. Cosmic horror, weird fiction, really influential on a lot of horror fiction that followed it. I think probably influential on Star Maker by Stapleton. It was published at least 20 years before Star Maker, and it has very similar kind of passages in it, celestial voyaging and stuff. Some amazing imagery. Hodgson, more than any other weird fiction guy that I've read, I've not read a ton of them, just had amazing imagery and world building in his stuff. I really loved it. The Midwich Cuckoos by Wyndham is my favorite Wyndham. I think most people would probably agree with me, is slow and a little boring in spots, just a little bit. I don't want this to be super one note with this criticism, this video, but the ending is amazing. Don't want to litter. Makes a philosophical point that I think is pretty risky and pretty hardcore. And I really value that. And I value him. I think that is his most sophisticated book that I've read. The Doomsters by Ross MacDonald is crime fiction. Great protagonist, great character work, believable world, lyrical, great prose. It's crime. I haven't gotten the bug for crime, so all the whodunit, actual plotting, I didn't find myself caring. All the stuff that goes on around it, I thought was remarkably good, and left me with the knowledge, I guess, that crime fiction can be as high of literary value as lit fic, or the kind of genre fiction that I have been reading. The Final Circle of Paradise by Boris and Arkady is a dystopian book told from the other end of the telescope. Most dystopian fiction is about the dangers of the individual being subsumed into the needs and desires of the collective. And this is a book about the collective being oppressed in its broader goals and visions by individualism. Very experimental and weird. It reads like Philip K. Dick, but like flintier and bleaker. It's a difficult read and a confusing read at points, but certainly memorable, certainly different. The Invincible by Stanislav Lem. I don't think Solaris is going to be unseated, probably even in my Lem reading. Who knows? The Invincible is a very serviceable, if slightly pulpy, book that deals with a lot of the same themes. I think it was published right before or right after Solaris. I think right after, actually. They made a video game out of it. It's got some cool stuff in it. It's Lem, so it's beautifully written. There's an interesting commentary about command and power dynamics that is good. It good, IMO, The Invincible. Probably not like great with a capital G, but very good. The Disaster Area is a short story collection from Ballard. I rated it higher than Drowned World. I don't exactly remember why, but I think that his short fiction doesn't suffer from some of the bandwidth loss of his longer form fiction, where the plot kind of winnows out at certain points. I think he's sharper. I don't know that he's better in short story form, but I guess he was better in this, although I don't vividly remember why. Who Goes There is the novella that The Thing was based on. It was written by John W. Campbell Jr. If you like the John Carpenter version of The Thing, read this, because the movie is pretty true to the source material, and you might be surprised by how much it reads like the movie. Heliconia Spring is the first of a trilogy from Aldous. Big, sprawling world building. Some great ecology, great aliens. It kind of reads like science fantasy. It's a multi-generational tale about a particular human colony on this alien world dealing with hostile life forms. It's pretty good, if long. Babel 17 by Delaney is his most famous book. Maybe Dahlgren, but I think Babel 17 is the one that people read because it's 1/10 the length. great philosophical, weird space opera about linguistics, about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is an idea that the language that you use prefigures what you can perceive of as real. Um, it's zany. It is pretty wild. It's hard to follow in spots because it's Delaney, but is a little more accessible than some of the other stuff that I've read from him. Not quite as accessible as Nova, I don't think, but it's good. The Haunting of Hill House is I want to call it a sleeper, but it's one of the most famous horror novels ever read. It was a sleeper to me. I had low expectations. I just kind of threw it in with some horror reading in a kind of, I don't know, offhanded way. It ended up totally knocking my little socks off, being an allegory about the kind of psychological perils of family life. It's a big twister of a novel, very sophisticated, and I was really impressed. Made me want to read more horror stuff. The Last Castle by Jack Vance seemingly is the ideological antithesis of Grey Prince. It's a story about an aristocracy being overthrown by a slave caste of aliens. It's a novella. It's quick, punchy. You can read it in one sitting, and it will give you a taste for the parts of Vance that are truly great. And if you like it, go on to read the Dying Earth books, because that side of Vance is truly great, and I think truly peerless in that sort of science fantasy stuff. The Gamesman by Barry Malzberg is a pretty difficult, little bit of a rocky road. It's a dystopian book that is very Kafkaesque. It's a fable about, I think, capitalism. Big keyword there. If you like The Hunger Games, if you like Kafka, the two of them together make The Gamesman. Kindred by Octavia Butler. Great, very brutal, surprisingly tough read about a black woman from the 70s who goes back in time to live as a slave on a plantation in the pre-war South. Utterly gut-wrenching. Surprised me with how violent it was and how dark it was. I think people should give Butler a chance, definitely, if you haven't read her. Other Days, Other Eyes. Beautiful fix-up hard SF novel. Bob Shaw wrote more beautiful hard SF than any other hard science fiction writer I've ever read. He is, to date, I think, probably the only guy or girl, person who I have read who can do that, who can do both. It's 3 little short stories with shorter interstitial stories. The interstitial stories, I think, are better than the main plot, but it's all good. Dawn by Octavia Butler is a skin-crawlingly weird and creepy science fiction horror about a woman who gets abducted by aliens on the brink or just after a nuclear apocalypse, along with a bunch of other people, and is treated as a pet by these aliens, essentially. It's not super easy to get me to put a book down and walk around because of disturbing content, but Butler managed to make that happen with me. The Instrumentality of Mankind is a lesser-known Cordwainer-Smith short story compilation that was a follow-up to the Best of Cordwainer-Smith short story collection. I read this in 2 sittings. I read the first half of it in about an hour. Unbelievably powerful writing. Was a side of Smith that was not nearly as apparent in Norstrilia, which is the only other material that I've read from him. I like this better than I like Norstrilia, which is his only novel. I think there are bits of it that are thematically, again, like there's subject matter in there that will be uncomfortable for like 99% of readers. A couple of blemishes on it, but for the most part, just one of the strangest and best writers in science fiction. The Book of Skulls by Silverberg is, depending on how you read the ending, either science fiction or fantasy or just lit fic. It's a travelogue about 4 college students going to investigate the possibility of an immortality cult in the Arizona desert. It is kind of its period, pretty risque and a little uncomfortable, but excellent book. The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson. If you like Doom, if you like Dying Earth stuff, The Nightland absolutely blew me away with how ahead of its time it was. It was written in 1912, written in a deliberately archaic prose style that turns a lot of people off, and it gets really, truly boring, like undeniably boring and redundant for a long part of it. But there are set pieces in it, like big action pieces and bits of world building that are just unbelievable that they were written in 1912. Ubik by Philip K. Dick. I hope they do make a movie out of it. They've been trying to do it for a few decades now. I don't like it quite as much as the other Dicks that are on this list. I get why people really love it. It's great. It's Philip K. Dick. It's weird. I think, I don't know. We know Ubik, right? It's very good. Ubik is very good, but not as good by one integer as Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, which I think has the highest high points of any Philip K. Dick book that I've read. I think it's him as a writer at his best, not as like an ideas guy, not as a world builder, but just as a writer. I think he hits his highs in this. It's not as even, not as smooth as Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Burning Chrome is a short story collection by William Gibson. It might be my favorite short story collection in science fiction. If you've read Neuromancer and you want more material like it that takes place in the same universe, there's a lot of it in Burning Chrome. And also there's stuff that is different, way different. Like there's a story called the Gernsback Continuum that's really clever. It's funny. I didn't think that Gibson was a funny writer, but Burning Chrome is great. The Electric Forest by Tanith Lee was the first Tanith Lee book that I've read. If you like Philip K. Dick, you should read this at least. Tanith Lee I've read a little bit from, and everything that I've read has just astonished me. She deserves to be much more widely read than she is and than she was. Farewell Earth's Bliss by D.G. Compton, probably the darkest, bleakest, most hopeless science fiction book that I've ever read. You can, again, read it in one sitting. Compton was just an amazing writer. Kind of like Butler in a certain way, in that his writing is unadorned, is pretty prosaic, but amazingly powerful. And his treatment of like sociological themes, I think, is up there with Le Guin. Star of the Unborn by Franz Werfel, another book that I've talked about arguably too much on the channel. I found it at a thrift store and happened to pull it on a random pick, and it was a fortuitous pick. It's a totally forgotten science fiction, fantasy, Stapledonian, big epic from the end of World War II that was critically panned when it was published and then tossed away until the 70s when it was republished. And there is an ebook that you can read a PDF scan of it online, but you can't download an ebook anywhere. But if you want to get a taste for it, then you can read part of it at least online and then decide if you want to go on and spend more money on it. It costs like $100 on eBay or whatever. I don't know that I would spend 100, but amazing book. The Sluts by Dennis Cooper is the most extreme novel I've ever read in my life. Definitely not for everybody. I'm not even going to summarize the plot here, but it is a book about the internet and how truth has a difficult time surviving in the internet. And I actually did read it in one sitting. See my review. See placeholder here, see my other review. I don't want to talk about it too much. It was so disturbing that I skipped whole sections of it, but amazing novel. Knight's Master by Tanith Lee, one of the best fantasy books that I've ever read. It's written in the style of Arabian Nights and mixes in a bunch of mythology from other traditions, like there's Abrahamic mythology and Greek mythology in it, and written just absolutely beautifully. And because of its format, reads as if it were a fix-up novel, but it was written deliberately as one piece, so it is more consistent and more even. Cannot recommend highly enough. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? I think, if pressed, I would say is the best Philip K. Dick book. I have voiced a couple of grievances or reservations about the Mercerism element in it. There's like that religious variable in this that's in all the PKD books that I've read that I don't love. Some people do. Um, it's great. It really works, and it totally lives up to the hype, which is pretty rare for books of that stature. But 100% I co-sign its status as a mega classic and as a book that everybody should read. Overlay by Barry Malzberg was written, I think, in the same year as Beyond Apollo, and was a first draft as Beyond Apollo and Gamesman were, which is just incredible. It's a book about gambling addicts, horse racing addicts, who are tapped by an alien intelligence to be agents of chaos and to foment the apocalypse on Earth. Just beautiful. A beautiful, weird, crunchy book. Truly not for everybody, I don't think. But I was just in love with it when I read it. The Doomed City by Boris and Arkady Strugatsky is a huge, long, truly strange meditation on 20th century ideologies and the role of the individual in the philosophical ferment of warring ideas of Marxism and capitalism and whatever, and the kind of tangible real world consequences of those kinds of ideologies at play. Truly amazing. I don't like it as much as Roadside Picnic, but I pretty much don't like anything as much as I like Roadside Picnic. But if any of that strikes you as interesting, absolutely recommended. We Who Are About To by Joanna Russ is, I think, the best feminist book that I've ever read in my life, and is also a meta SF satire or critique. So interesting to read after reading a bunch of stuff from the Golden Age and the kind of triumphalist, conquest-based SF narratives, of which this is a critique in large part. It's split into two very distinct sections. A lot of people don't really get along with the second half. I think it's very important. I really loved every bit of the book. It is not a crowd pleaser. Beyond Apollo by Barry Malzberg is his most famous book. It's all over the place. It's written from first and third person perspective. It's written in this fragmentary style of multiple chapters, he says. A bunch of scattershot short chapters, and the narration is unreliable. It's funny. It's a satire of like the space program and American values of the 70s. I think it's sublime. Another one that's definitely not for everybody. Speaking of not for everybody, Ice by Anna Kavan. Some people argue is not science fiction. Clearly, I argue that it is. I think, in terms of just raw literary merit, might be the best science fiction book that I've read. It's like a five-dimensional object that you have to look at from every angle and in every light. And you still don't quite get a bead on exactly what's going on there. It reminds me in that way of Gene Wolfe, but Anna Kavan is a better writer than Gene Wolfe. I'm sorry if that pisses some people off, but it's true. You kind of have to read Ice to have some idea of what it maybe is about. And the best book that I read this year was Bad Brains by Kathy Koja, one of two books, along with Roadside Picnic, that I've given a perfect 10 to on this channel. It's by far the best horror book that I've ever read. I haven't read a ton of horror. Kathy Koja kicks ass. She's an amazing writer. Has this understated, almost like modernist flourish to her prose that is like, I don't know, electric is kind of a corny word, but it's like, it just has this gothy, weird, menacing edge that works in perfect synchrony with a subject matter that is just so like emotionally affecting to me. There are very, very, very few books that have left quite as big of an emotional impact on me as Bad Brains. It gets criticized, and I in turn get criticized at times for advocating for a horror book that isn't scary because the monster in it isn't that scary, which I guess I agree with. It's not the point. Don't want to spoil anything, but read it. It's about a man's mind unraveling, told from his subjective perspective, and it's a book about life in this consumerist hellscape in the Midwest in the 90s. It's just, it's perfect for me. It's a perfect 10 for me, I will say. There are two books that I read that I chose not to rank for different reasons. One of them is The Decay of the Angel by Yukio Mishima. It's the last in a tetralogy called The Sea of Fertility that is considered his masterpiece. I happened to find this at a bookstore in Mexico, and it had a cool cover, so stupidly I just bought it and read it. Kind of in the back of my head thinking like this is ill-advised, and it probably was. I didn't fully understand what was going on, which is kind of true of Mishima typically anyway. I do recommend it, but I don't recommend doing what I did. And I have to now go back and reread the whole thing at some point. But Mishima is a singular writer, someone whose politics I find, we'll say, contemptible. Although it's not clear on how much of it was performance and how much was actual conviction on Mishima's part. I think that's pretty contested. But a truly incredible writer. And Negative Space by B.R. Yeager is a horror book that reminded me way too strongly of things that happened around me in high school that I have a lot of held over mixed feelings of grief and anger about. And it colored my reading of the book to the point where I wasn't really comfortable weighing in on if I liked the book or not, because I felt I could not be even remotely objective because the events, the experience of reading it was just too wrapped up with my own personal history. Anyway, hope that's not oversharing, just by way of explaining why that's not on there. One take, Patreon, $5 gets you everything. All right.